Shantha, would you also like to tell us a little bit more about Mobility for Africa?
Sure. Can you hear me? Yes.
We can hear you.
Um, so I essentially we believe that mobility, especially in rural Africa, has been a sort of a silent crisis, I call it. Um, I worked for a long time in development and went to many rural parts of the continent. And over the last 20 years, I got stuck by the fact that women have such heavy burdens. They have to carry heavy loads, they have to walk long distances, whether this be for collecting water, for collecting firewood, for getting their kids to the clinic to get vaccinated, to taking their goods to the market. It's a real issue because not only is it a physical burden for them, but it steals a great deal of their time. And so essentially mobility Africa is trying to leverage the what I think is the new revolution going on in electric transport. As we know, Europe has made commitments. Many countries are moving to how they can convert their, fleet of combustible engines to green energy. And Mobility for Africa believes that we can take that technology, and with the investment going on in renewable energy, which is happening in Africa, we can combine renewable energy with new technology and battery storage and try and find affordable green solutions for rural communities, for all communities, but especially for rural women who we know carry the heaviest burden. So, in terms of the SDGs, as I said, I think mobility is one of the enabling factors for all of the SDGs. If people can't find new ways to farm or to survive the climate shocks that are ahead in rural areas, then there's going to be more hunger. There's going to be more poverty. We're not going to meet the education goals. It's sort of got a trickle effect. So the other thing that's important to remember in the continent is there's a huge demographic shift going on. So there's a lot of young people, and there is a lot of movement to urban areas. And why? Because urban areas offer a lot more. They offer transport, mobility, they offer opportunity. And one of the thinking, my belief is that if we can make rural areas more dynamic and unleash the potential there by making life easier and making farming easier and use mobility as the catalyst, we can address a lot of the issues and barriers to development that rural communities have faced for a long time. But as I said, I'm really focused on the women because for a long time I think they've been ignored. It's been acceptable that they just spend huge parts of their day carrying heavy burdens. So that's what we're trying to do. We're testing out three-wheeler tricycles that are powered by lithium batteries using a battery swapping model. So the batteries are being charged on renewable energy, and when the women need a fresh tank of fuel, so to speak, they come and we swap a battery for them. So it's still a pilot stage. We're still learning, but we're very excited and believe that if we can get the formula right, we could expand to many rural areas.
I know that empowering rural women, as you said, is very important and very core to the mission of Mobility for Africa. So do you think it's important for these women to regain the sense of agency of their own lives, rather, for example, than through organizations who are offering them monetary aid or more direct support in terms of money?
Well, it sort of goes back to what Felicity was talking about, and the fact that obviously people usually don't want to leave their homes. It's fairly drastic decision making that forces people to risk their lives crossing borders and all the dangerous challenges they face on the way, and then the more complicated existence they face when they get to a new country. So I think there's so much work to be done to try and solve often what's very complicated problems, political, economic. But I do think that climate change is going to obviously have a very big burden in terms of migration. All the science indicates that. In southern Africa, where we're working, we have seen years of drought. Thankfully, we've got lots of rainy season from El Nino at the moment, and I think there's a lot of talk about how we mitigate risk. and how we build resilience in communities. But I think we have to get very practical about what that means. And I have great faith in rural women. I have spent a lot of time in rural areas, and women are very entrepreneurial. They are very committed to feeding their families, getting their kids educated. Often they just face enormous barriers to doing that. And so I think the investment we need to make is trying to create and support their agency. And often they face internal gender barriers. Culture can be a problem. Women can not have control of their own finances, or get relegated to working all the time because they carry the heaviest burden. So one of the things that we're trying to do at Mobility for Africa, in our pilot, we just focused on women because we want to prove, first of all, they can drive a tricycle, which to you and I sounds like, wow, of course they can drive. But if this is something new, and traditionally it's the men that, will have a bicycle or a motorbike, it's changing power relations within that. And what's been really exciting is to watch how these women have now a greater sense of power. They're working in groups of 3 so that they share a tricycle between themselves, which mitigates the husband taking over the tricycle. And the men have to ask them for a lift. If there's a funeral, it's the women that are transporting people to the funeral or to church. So it's subtly, I'm hoping for a little quiet revolution in terms of gender, but I do believe that it's really important that we care for people in our communities, but we also don't ignore some of the big global challenges. So we need to continue to care about people in faraway places that we don't think have anything to do with our immediate lives. But I think how we help them is important. And I think the more we can invest in solutions that do give them agency and reinforce their dignity and give them an opportunity to solve their problems, the more success we'll have. And often what happens is we wait for the situation to get so bad that it ends in emergencies and conflict, and then it's much more expensive to solve, and it's much more heart-wrenching and devastating for human life and the communities themselves. So I'm a real believer that if we can get creative and leverage some of the new technology, but in a way that's practical, and we listen to communities, we've done a lot of focus group discussions, we spend a lot of time with our women, learning from them, getting feedback, and I think that's really, really important. There's no quick fixes to these problems.
So I completely agree. Thank you so much for sharing that. I definitely think such a key part of the kind of helping a community, maybe as you said, that we're not so involved in, is understanding that community, and kind of that change also comes from. Talking a little bit about the sustainable revolution that you touched on briefly, how do you think that for countries who are considered as still undergoing development and industrialization, do you think they can move directly onto a sustainable development model, or instead of passing through kind of the traditional but detrimental process that a lot of other countries have already gone through?
No, I think we're in a really exciting time because, for example, we've seen it with the digital revolution. We no longer need to connect cell phone cables, landlines across huge kilometres. We can now use mobile phones. We have mobile data. We are testing out new battery technology. There's huge research and R&D going in. I'm trying to leverage that R&D to go to the poorest part of the world, not just stay with those that can appear to afford it. So I think there's lots of ways we can leapfrog progress. And I think it's a mix of leveraging the technology that exists and is being developed, and then applying it and testing and piloting and experimenting and putting resources into that research of application in poorer places and resource poor settings and rural communities. Not expecting it to instantly solve the problems, but giving time to learn and listen and adapt. But I'm really hopeful in that sense. I don't think we have an excuse. I think we can solve it, and we can avoid a lot of the messy environmental consequences of industrialization. We still need countries to have industry, but how they develop their industry can obviously be a lot cleaner and provide a lot more dignified work rather than the models we've seen in other countries that are much more exploitative.
How do you think that young individuals like me, for example, can best educate or gear ourselves towards addressing these sustainable development goals? And the second part, how can older generations, especially those who maybe think they're too far down their career or they've already got other interests and they can't really transition anymore, how can they really shift their perspective and also start fostering change?
I feel like the new generation, your generation, Agatha, is very pragmatic. And I think we've got to be practical and pragmatic and not be afraid, which is where a lot of the politics is going these days. But I see the younger generation as being far more open-minded on every level. So I'm really hopeful that if we can keep young people engaged and make them lead, I think we'll solve some of these problems that sometimes feel intractable. So the old people, I know I'm old, I've had a career change, and I think we need to follow the lead and become a little bit more pragmatic in our approach.
One question for you, Shantha, particularly, was about the organization of the women's training. So I know you mentioned groups of three, but could you please explain a little bit further how a typical training goes?
So we've been trying to obviously prove that we can create a viable, sustainable model. So we've been testing different types of approaches. And one of the things is we know that women might be poor, but they still spend quite a bit of time and money on transport. And we know that if you look at a community, there's a lot of unmet demand in a community for transport. So instead of just focusing on individuals, which often is the case when people look at business models, we're trying to look at what's the aggregate demand in a community. So what we've done is in our pilot, we have some women working together in groups of three that are working in agriculture and horticulture. So they have been, in addition to their day jobs, they've been using the mobility to grow certain extra types of crops or experiment. One of our groups grew 2 tons of onions and 2 tons of potatoes because they didn't have to carry the manure so far. And then we've had women in the trading sector and small scale enterprise. So, for example, one of our oldest participants is 68 years old and she learnt to drive. We have a training course, a 5-day training course, and she and her daughter sell buns in an underground oven, and then they go with the Humber and deliver the buns and sell them in the community. And that, of course, increases hugely her income because she's selling more buns. And then we've also set up a transport and logistics service. So we've been basically, the women are in groups of 3, and it's a bit like a transport Uber system where they can get booked to take someone to the clinic or the bank or wherever they need to go in this sort of 25-kilometre radius. And we've also tested giving Humbers to the local health workers and to the police and the agricultural extension workers, because often local civil servants don't have transport, so it impacts on the way they deliver their services. So at this point, we believe that we're building a case to prove that you can really cater to lots of different aspects of demand in a community if you're flexible.